From foreign policy and the climate investment funds, this is Heat of the Moment. I'm John Sutter. Well, we've made it to the final episode of our season devoted entirely to looking at the various aspects of a just transition. That's this idea that as we move away from fossil fuels, whole communities have to be taken into account. We have to think about what happens to our society as we push towards clean energy and toward a decarbonized economy. This episode is a little different from others this season. During the second half of the show, you're going to hear an excerpt from a live Twitter Spaces conversation that I had with Dr. Catherine Wilkinson. She's a leading voice in the climate movement, as well as the co-founder and executive director of the All We Can Save project. But before that, we want to share with you our final field report, and it comes from a country at the center of many of the world's just transition efforts, South Africa. In our first two episodes, Elna Schutz profiled the town of Komati, located 100 miles east of Johannesburg, where a coal-fired power plant had just closed its doors, and community members, government officials, and activists all were weighing in on what to do next.
We expect to learn from it, correct as we move, and certainly use the lesson learned for future decommissioning of additional plants.
There's been a massive infusion of time, effort, and economic resources into helping figure out what will happen to Komati and how to ensure that the community will rebound from this loss. But in this last episode, we also want to talk about the flip side of things, the opportunities created in other communities by turning towards green technology. For this story, Elna traveled west to look at another area of South Africa where a very different topography is lending itself to new opportunities.
The Northern Cape is the largest and most sparsely populated province in South Africa, and also one of the warmest. As far as the eye can see, there's nothing much apart from blue skies and shrubs. And if you're unlucky, some poisonous snakes.
The ones more common here is the Cape Cobra, the Pofade, the Spitting Cobra. The three of them are quite dangerous.
But the one thing that's very noticeable in this landscape is Key Solar 1. It's a big white tower which is so bright at the top that you can't really look straight at it. Jose Caruela is the general manager of this concentrated solar power, or CSP, plant, which is owned by a Spanish company.
This solar one was the first CSP tower in Africa in operation. It's one of the tallest buildings in the continent. It's more than 200 meters high. They were working here around, the peak was around 2,000 people. And now during the operation, we have 100 people working, not every day, but almost from time to time.
Most of these employees are locals, and some of them moved into renewable energy from coal-fired power stations. When we talk about making the energy transition just, it's important to not only move away from dirty fuels, but to find adequate jobs and reskilling if necessary for those workers. The people at Key Solar 1 are an example of what this might look like.
Okay, we are currently standing right in front of the solar field.
This is Petunia Fundisiwe Zondo, one of the operations managers at Key Solar 1.
But we'll see when we jump off.
Before we get into more of her story, she takes me on a tour and explains how the plant works. The solar field is huge. It's around 600 hectares or 1,500 acres worth of big panels covered in mirrors, tilted upwards. Those are called heliostats.
As you can see, the heliostats reflects the sun to the cavity. On the cavity, there is a lot of pipes that you won't be able to see from where we're standing with water.
The cavity is a hole at the top of that big white tower I mentioned. It's much larger than most lighthouses, but you can imagine a similar shape.
As the reflection happens from the solar field, from the heliostats on the solar field, they boil the water into steam. And then from there, it will be transferred to drive the turbine actually and produce electricity.
And that electricity then goes into the national grid. It's sold to Eskom.
Yes,
It's quite an overwhelming sight, both in its size and how unbelievably bright the reflection is. When I try to photograph it, it almost looks unrealistically photoshopped because neither my eyes nor my camera can quite capture it. We find a quiet, cool office to chat more. Petunia tells me she was always interested in doing something that helped others.
I always wanted to be a doctor, but later on it changed. I think as I was doing mathematics and physical science, I actually thought of being an engineer.
After graduating, Petunia went straight into the fossil fuel industry.
I've worked with different power stations, like big power stations like Letabo Power Station, and Kendall at some point, and Komati as well.
But after several years working in the northeastern part of the country where coal is mined and processed, she turned her gaze west to where the first renewable plants were being built.
I moved because, global warming is one of the topics that is sensitive currently with reducing carbon emissions. So I got interested into that actually, and I think that's when the renewables started to make sense to me and become a passion in my career path.
Petunia says that the move to renewable energy was surprisingly easy to adapt to. The job is a little less busy and really interesting.
I think coal, it's a little bit more busier. They're running 6 units, so there's a lot of activities happening. So with the renewable, it's only one turbine that you're looking after. However, when it's cloudy, it becomes slightly challenging.
A very big part of this conversation internationally is about skills transfer and making sure that in a just transition, jobs are being held. So when we close or slowly decommission coal-fired power plants, we want to make sure that those people have jobs and are either reskilled or skilled anew for renewables. Petunia says for her, the transition to a job in renewable energy has been fairly smooth.
It was very easy for me to do transition from coal-fired power station to the solar power station because most of the systems are similar. We've got boilers, they've got boilers. We've got a turbine, they've got a turbine. I've learned the turbine from the coal-fired power station.
Petunia is aware that renewables aren't perfect either, of course. Often the construction uses more carbon-heavy means, and the projects are usually smaller. Kisola 1, for instance, produces 50 megawatts per hour, whereas one unit at a coal-fired power plant can make around 600 megawatts. And working in a far-flung place does come with a price. Petunia's children and family are in Johannesburg, where there are more schooling options, while they were able to be with her when she worked in coal.
I have to time and again travel back home to see my kids and my family. That's the only thing that is like sometimes, frustrating a little bit, but the environment is the same. It's easy to get used to it.
This is a cheeky question, but do you like your job here better or working with coal-fired plants?
Now that we are transitioning to the zero net emissions, of course, I would like to be the future. The future is on the renewables, so it's gonna be sustainable. So I would prefer to remain on renewables.
Do you think it'll be possible to do so fairly for all the workers, considering that renewables often use less workers?
With the nature of renewables, yes, because I don't think that it's necessary to have a lot of unnecessary manpower. It's just the nature of the renewables, unfortunately. But with more projects coming, of course, they will expand the number of people working in the renewables.
Petunia is just one example of what the transition into renewables may look like for people on the ground. And it is important to emphasize that she is a highly skilled worker and not employed by a third-party contractor, which makes her, in some ways, part of the luckier few. But her story gives hope and perspective to others looking at how this can work.
I know that the more we produce electricity without emitting the environment, the better for the future and the better for the global warming. So I'm actually very glad to be part of the team that is involved in making sure that the future is taken care of.
Many thanks to Elna Schutz for that story. And now onto our featured conversation, which took place earlier today on Twitter Spaces. I had the chance to speak with renowned author and climate thought leader, Catherine Wilkinson. She's the co-founder and executive director of the All We Can Save project, and has been a leading global voice on solutions to the climate crisis, as well as climate feminism. We spoke about all of that, and specifically about the context of a just transition. Here's our conversation. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our live recording of Heat of the Moment from Foreign Policy and the Climate Investment Funds. I'm John Sutter, the host of this podcast, and I'm super excited to have with me today Catherine Wilkinson, who does all the things, but among them is a co-founder of the All We Can Save project. So thrilled to have you here, Catherine, and excited to hear your thoughts on all things climate and solutions-y. How are you?
Hi, John. I'm really excited to be having this chat with you.
Catherine, can you just start off for people who aren't familiar with it? Like, tell us about the All We Can Save project. It started as a book, right? A collection of essays by women in the climate movement, and then it's kind of become like a movement in its own right, I would say. Yeah.
Oh, well, that feels like, a very high bar. But I'll entertain walking on it. So the All We Can Save project is really kind of an outgrowth of the anthology All We Can Save that came out in September 2020, and much to our publisher's surprise, became a national bestseller, which we were really delighted about.
Congratulations.
Well, thank you. For folks who haven't seen that book, it is a collection, as John said, of writings by women climate leaders, essays, as well as poetry and art. And as we were kind of, at that final leg of shepherding the book out into the world, we thought, this is really more than a book. And we're going to want to be able to do some more things with this book, like create resources for educators that want to bring it into the classroom, like All We Can Save circles, which are a kind of small group model for deep learning and relational organizing, using the book as a jumping off point. So the All We Can Save project has been shepherding that work. The mission that we wake up and think about every day is nurturing the leaderful climate community that we need for a just and life-giving future. And that word leaderful to us means a lot of things. It means a bigger climate team. It means a more diverse and inclusive climate team, a more courageous and perhaps also more soulful community doing this work.
I've heard you speak before on issues of not just women in the climate movement, but climate feminism, and also why climate is a gender issue. And I'm wondering if you could break that down for people who may be unfamiliar with that pairing, right? Of pairing feminism and climate justice. Like, how are these things linked? How do you see that space?
Absolutely. Well, it's interesting, actually, if we go kind of way back into early history of climate science, these things turn out to be connected. And then I'll maybe bring us forward to the present day. So Eunice Newton-Foote, and I think today is International Women's Day, so this feels appropriate to be lifting up her name. She, in many ways, was the grandmother of climate science, but was largely sort of forgotten and written out of the history books until quite recently, actually.
Mm-hmm.
But in 1856, she published a paper that connected the dots between carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the Earth's temperature. And she, like a lot of women in that era, did not have sort of resources and institutional affiliations. I think she actually did her experiments in her backyard. But 66 years ago. Don't ask me to do math, please. She
a while back.
a while back, many moons. Right? She connected these dots, and what's interesting is that she was also very involved in the early movement for women's rights and women's suffrage. You can see her name on the list of signatories to the Seneca Falls Declaration. That was maybe about a decade before she published that paper. So I like to imagine Eunice as this person who was both faithful to science and to equality, and maybe she was an early climate feminist, though perhaps those were not quite the dots she was connecting. I don't know. And when we kind of fast forward to the present, right, we hear a lot about climate change as a threat multiplier. And when we think about a world with existing vulnerabilities and injustices, those are among the things that climate change multiplies, right? As I know you've been covering some this season, John. So when we think about our world today, which is unfortunately still a rather gender unequal world, it's perhaps not surprising that as climate impacts hit, we see, for example, women and girls face greater risk of displacement or death from extreme weather events. We have data now that connects early marriage and sex work, which are sometimes last resort survival strategies, to droughts and floods. We see gender-based violence spike when climate impacts hit. We saw this, for example, when the wildfires were raging in Australia. So these are just kind of a few examples that we might not necessarily think of, right? And yet, there are gender injustices at work as climate change unfolds, which also means that we really need gender responsive strategies for solving this challenge and figuring out how to survive it as well. And then the other piece that I think about a lot is that when we think about virtually any climate decision-making space, right, from United Nations climate negotiations to national political and legal systems to leadership in business and finance and technology, we basically don't have gender equal leadership in, I think, probably any of those spaces, yeah. Right? Yeah. Where there are major decisions being made about our collective future. And what we also have some interesting data on is that from the local level to the national level, when women are present in climate decision-making and kind of climate leadership, the outcomes for the planet are better. And so, this isn't just something that's like, well, it sounds fair, right? Like half the world should be equally represented in our collective future, but it's such a simple idea. Yeah. This is a really strategic thing.
We've been talking like this season on the podcast a lot about this idea of a just transition away from fossil fuels. Like, if everyone's agreeing that, as they should, that we have to move as fast as possible away, from fossil fuels and towards a carbon neutral economy, like thinking about issues of fairness in that shift. And I think that, like, I don't know, when we started the season, a lot of times when I would hear people use the term just transition, they were just talking about like coal communities or like oil communities, like places where fossil fuels are produced and like the jobs of those workers being displaced as you shift from, say coal to solar or wind. I feel like that term is becoming much more expansive though over time. And like, I'm curious what you think of it, like, and how you define a just transition, what that means for you.
I learned a lot, or maybe sort of expanded some of my thinking about this in the process of putting together an episode from our second season of A Matter of Degrees, which this was when Build Back Better was still being called Build Back Better, right? And we were, like, okay, there's going to be, infusions of cash coming into climate transformation can we have green jobs for all? Question mark. And right, because, okay, we could have these promises of big investments in a clean energy economy, but who's actually getting the education, the training? Where's the workforce development happening to ensure that, folks who have struggled or suffered in our kind of petro-driven economy are positioned to be beneficiaries of those investments and kind of the new economy emerging. And so I think that immediately takes you beyond just, coal country, right? Or oil country. And I think takes you into every community and every space where we'll be retrofitting homes, right? And installing heat pumps and electric vehicle infrastructure. But maybe one of the really interesting conversations I had for that episode was with Christina Kwok, who has done a lot of really fascinating work at the nexus of gender and climate, specifically around girls' education. And she was challenging us to think about, what are actually the bounds of the green economy, or the bounds of a just transition. And one of the things she was really advocating for in that episode was like, care work is part of a just transition, right? These industries, education, healthcare, all dimensions of care work that are, women are actually overrepresented in those fields. Well, they become really critical when we think about what does a resilient society look like, right? What is it going to look like to try to survive? And also, interestingly, many of those fields and professions are low carbon professions. And so, she was sort of advocating also, like, if we're not thinking more expansively and holistically, we're going to miss some things that we really need to be investing in for our collective climate future. And come on, like, let's not again sort of have women sort of short shrifted in all of this as well.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about energy, you think about like any moments of like big transition, especially in the energy sphere and big like manufacturing spheres, it usually comes with like some pretty large degree of like social like upheaval, like it's never it's never been historically like a smooth thing. And so I just think it's such an important conversation to have. I think sometimes people hear the term just transition or like thinking around that, and it used to flag like almost someone who's trying to pump the brakes on the transition away from fossil fuels, right? Like that we don't move too fast, but I think it's like a yes and kind of thing, right? Like, yes, we have to move as fast as possible, and yes, also we have to take into account like what does this do to our society and our workforce and all the tangled things that are like that are wrapped up in that. It's anything
totally
but simple, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, the way I sort of think about it is, how do we not leave people or communities behind in this deeply liminal time that we're living in, right? Where we are, where we are taking apart some things, building lots of other things. And, I think in any moment of just a lot of disruption and a lot of change, I feel like those are the moments when people and communities fall through the cracks. And so, how do we have attention to that, so that the future economy is not just a clean energy and a low carbon economy, but it is, genuinely a life-giving economy, in the biggest sense. As if we don't have enough to do. Am I right?
As if we don't have enough to do. What are the things like you look for as like a signal of whether that's happening or not, right? Like I think sometimes these conversations get so big, it's like, okay, if I'm watching a policy conversation, like how do I know if these things are genuinely being taken into account, or if it's that we're giving more lip service to it, but it's not really a thing that's happening? How do you watch that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think, for example, the emergence of Justice 40 out of New York and California and onto kind of the national climate policy radar and set of commitments from the White House was, that to me was a significant indicator.
And for people who aren't familiar with that, could you break that down just a bit? Yeah.
Yes. The Justice 40 initiative, right, goes back to this question of federal investment, and where does that go and who benefits? And so the Justice 40 initiative is about directing 40% of the overall benefits of climate investments toward disadvantaged communities, right? Communities that have been marginalized in our current fossil fuel economy. And of course, there's a lot to unpack in that, right? Of like, well, what do we mean by benefits, and what communities count as disadvantaged? But I think there's a lot of work, I think, still to be done on realizing the promise of Justice 40. But I think just the fact that is now, that is a core commitment, that there are senior leaders in the federal government who are shepherding Justice 40, that felt to me like a really big piece. And I think when you look at the state level, seeing workforce development funds, for example, go into clean energy and other climate related fields, right? There's a ton of work to be done, and we don't have the labor to do it currently. And so, I think as we see, even in my home state and formerly your momentary state, Sean, Georgia, right? Like, it's been really interesting to see Republican leaders in the state kind of go from bashing the Inflation Reduction Act as, socialist policy to like, well, actually, we really like the things that are happening around these,
interesting. There's money coming here. Yeah.
And, this turns out to be pretty good for the people of Georgia. So it'll be interesting, right, then to see, do we actually start to see beyond Democratic leadership around, workforce development, et cetera, on these things. And of course, I think it's so exciting just seeing some stats about how many young people want to be working in the climate field, right? Like just the kind of upwelling of energy to be part of this transition in some way.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Justice 40, because I think like it's more, it takes it one step further than just a statement of principle, right? Like we want this investment to be like equitable, like some ethereal, mysterious way, like versus like, okay, we're actually putting X percent of the dollars that we're putting into this into specific projects that will, like you said, hopefully benefit people who have been marginalized. And the definitions around that, for sure worth like talking through, but that it's tied to like money, I guess, is like what makes it seem different and potentially replicable in other parts of the world where, like everyone's in kind of this, like you said, this deeply liminal space. I like that. That's a way to describe it.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So when, we've known each other a number of years now. And when we first met, I think you were working at Project Drawdown, which, if people aren't familiar, really did a pretty incredible thing in terms of like putting out there into the world a deep analysis of solutions to the climate crisis, and to my mind, at least, like quantifying sort of for the first time, like how these things stack up in terms of what they do to global emissions. And you were the lead writer on the first Drawdown book that came out in, was it like 2017, 2018?
2017. Yeah. Wow.
It's been a minute. But I just think that book and that analysis has been so influential in terms of like giving people hope and giving people specifics.
I think that clearly the crux of the climate challenge is an energy challenge, right? And meaning both sources of energy and also the ways that we use it. And also, I think, drawdown certainly elevated, I think, as well, the issues in our food systems, plant-rich diets, reducing food waste. And of course, there were whole suites of land-based solutions. So both around agriculture and around ecosystem protection and restoration. And I think, I hope that a lot more people came to understand the power and the importance of carbon sinks in the natural world, and also the limitations of them, right? I hear sometimes from people who are real kind of evangelists in that space, well, like if we just let nature do it, it's like, unfortunately, the fossil fuel era has put so much carbon into the atmosphere that there's not enough land on this planet to solve it, quote unquote, naturally. And certainly not if we continue emitting at the rate we currently are. And so, more than anything, I hope it was a bit of a seeing the forest for the trees kind of project. And that was certainly something we tried to strengthen as well in the Drawdown Review, which was the follow-up to Drawdown that we released for free on Project Drawdown's website. Bad timing. It was March 2020. So if you missed it, there were other things going on.
Just a couple of things.
But, really trying to help people wrap their heads around the whole system of solutions that we need, mostly to stop sending greenhouse gases up into the air, but also to bring some of that carbon back home.
I think it's like, I agree with you. It's natural to want to do your part and to do what you can as a way to feel connected to this uber global intergenerational issue, but not to feel the weight of it every single day.
Who wants to come to that party, right?
Right.
Who wants to come to the climate shame?
No, we're
party?
more fun than that. Yeah.
I know. And I'm so I also think part of it is about movement building also, right? That nobody's going to show up for this. Well, obviously some people do. But the vast majority of people are not going to show up if they feel like their life is going to be picked apart, especially when, many of the big solutions we could implement in our individual lives are often financially out of reach for people, and that's one of the things the Inflation Reduction Act obviously is trying to change. But it can feel like you're damned if you do and damned if you don't.
I want to kind of end on a general note. You're someone who I always feel energized after speaking with you. I feel like in general, you maintain a sense of purpose and optimism in the true sense of that word, not in the the fake shiny everything should be fine and so I'm going to say that. I feel like you that your persistence on this issue shows a belief that things can get better and in some ways are getting better. I tend to sometimes slide more into the look at the global carbon math. This is a mess. We have to decarbonize way faster. What in the big picture, how do you see things? How do you what keeps you going in this space? And in the face of stuff that's is truly daunting. And I know you see that in a very clear-eyed way.
Yeah, it's insanely daunting. And I've certainly gone through my bouts of feeling quite disillusioned with the climate movement, feeling quite pretty hopeless about about whether we can get it done. And I think, I don't know, there's been something for me in this work about having to change my relationship with uncertainty and with the unknown, and to constantly be like placing myself back as just like one node in this incredible ecosystem of people who are showing up to try to make things better in this really daunting moment. And, you know, there were a couple of years, I published my first book in 2012 and then kind of stepped back really from climate work for a couple of years. And that didn't make anything better. You know, I was like, maybe the only thing that's harder than being in this work is being out of this work. And, you know, I have no idea if we will actually be able to, you know, pull off coming back into some form of reciprocity with the planet's living systems. But it absolutely feels like the most important work to be doing. And so that kind of keeps me going.
And I feel like the title of your podcast, Matter of Degrees, means like 17 different things potentially. But one of them is like, it's like the degree to which we do more matters, right? That sort of like realist version of like why to be persistently optimistic and to not give up. I find that pretty inspiring.
Yeah, we changed actually the logo or the show art for A Matter of Degrees this season, and there's on our website it's a little animated version, and you've got like little people with protest signs and little person with a bicycle thing, and some people moving a solar panel, and some other people doing some legislation work, and somebody planting something. And you know, I'm like, like that's kind of, you know, like nothing any of us could do will ever come close to being enough in the like most global sense of that word. But man, I think with so many more of us contributing in ways that give us a sense of, you know, authentic power and joy and participation in whatever this big thing is that I think we're all part of. Like, that's, I don't know, that to me is like, that's the only theory of change that makes sense to me. So I show up for that.
Well, Catherine, this has been like a pleasure. Thank you so much for doing this and, you know, for all the work that you do.
Thank you so much for having me on the pod.
My thanks to Catherine Wilkinson. You really should check out her podcast, Matter of Degrees. It's worth a listen. And that'll do it for this episode and for season 3 of Heat of the Moment. Heat of the Moment is a partnership between foreign policy and the climate investment funds. Our production staff includes Rosie Julin, Rob Sachs, Scott Andrews, Hugh Seawright, Dan Efron, Laura Rossbrow-Tellum, Claudia Tatey, and Yurei Wu. The Climate Investment Funds is a nonpartisan champion of climate action. Political views and opinions expressed in this series do not necessarily represent those of the Climate Investment Funds, foreign policy, or their partners. Until next time, I'm John Sutter. Thanks for listening.